Picture a drafty harbor in the year 1930 and watch an elderly gentleman named Jules Rimet carefully tuck a golden trophy into his suitcase, as if he were packing his last worldly possession. 2 weeks aboard a pitching steamship, right in the middle of the greatest economic catastrophe in human history, just to save a football tournament that virtually nobody actually wanted to attend. And right here begins a story packed with theft, dogs, hidden shoeboxes, and the magnificent fragility of national ego. 1. Long before anyone dreamed of world championships, England and Scotland met on the 30th of November 1872 in Glasgow for the very first official international football match, drawing an audience of roughly 4,000 paying spectators curious enough to show up in the Scottish cold. The legendary result of this historic encounter, the moment that was supposedly destined to change the entire sporting world forever, was a thoroughly unremarkable 0-0 draw. Imagine the single most important invention in modern mass sport launching with exactly the same electric energy as an unanswered LinkedIn connection request sent to a vague acquaintance from secondary school. 2. While Europe still confidently assumed it was the undisputed center of the footballing universe, a tiny South American nation called Uruguay arrived at the Paris Olympics of 1924 and systematically humiliated their self-assured hosts with a style of play that combined joy, precision, and absolute mastery. The Uruguayans took gold, and 4 years later in Amsterdam they simply repeated the entire performance against every shred of European resistance. That is roughly the equivalent of an unknown startup embarrassing the established corporate giants on their own trade show floor 2 consecutive times while everyone watches in stunned silence. 3. In 1928, Jules Rimet formally proposed a standalone world championship dedicated exclusively to football, and the European associations responded with the diplomatic enthusiasm of a tax auditor handed a surprise assignment on a Monday morning. They complained bitterly about the long ocean voyage and the crippling costs while the global economy was simultaneously collapsing in spectacular fashion. And yet Rimet's vision prevailed regardless. It was essentially the earliest recorded case of someone inventing an entirely new industry, while every single person in the room patiently explains why it can never possibly work. 4. On the 13th of July 1930, inside the Estadio Pochitos in Montevideo, French striker Lucien Laurent scored the very first goal in the history of the FIFA World Cup during a group stage match against Mexico that almost nobody outside the stadium considered remotely important. The man who created this immortal moment later recalled almost no specific details because in that moment, absolutely nobody understood the colossal historical weight that single strike would one day carry. Today, every self-documenting influencer would have filmed that goal from 3 angles, monetized the footage within the hour, and launched an emotional mini-documentary about their own personal journey of sacrifice. 5. The first ever World Cup final on the 30th of July 1930 brought together fierce rivals Uruguay and Argentina before a roaring crowd of approximately 80,000 spectators inside the newly constructed Estadio Centenario in Montevideo, built specifically for this occasion. The tension between the two nations ran so violently high that neither team could agree on which ball to use, so the tournament officials simply decided each half would be played with a different ball entirely. It is the sporting equivalent of 2 business partners arguing over whose pen to use in the middle of signing a multi-million-dollar contract, while the lawyers watch in quiet disbelief. 6. Uruguay won that historic final 4-2, but back across the river in Buenos Aires, the devastated Argentine supporters responded not with gracious sporting acknowledgement or quiet disappointment, but with immediate fury. Enraged crowds pelted the Uruguayan consulate in Argentina with stones, and the already tense diplomatic relations between the 2 neighboring countries cooled noticeably for months afterwards. One could argue this was the first fully documented case of a lost match, triggering a real-world comment section war conducted entirely with actual projectiles rather than keyboard strokes. 7. When Italy hosted the Second World Cup in 1934, the dictator Benito Mussolini wasted absolutely no time converting the entire sporting spectacle into a colossal propaganda machine designed to broadcast the power and glory of his fascist regime to the watching world. Italy won the tournament, though persistent and well-founded speculation about suspicious refereeing decisions and heavy political pressure applied to opposing teams continues to circulate actively among historians to this day. It bears an uncomfortable resemblance to a company director who organizes the internal performance competition, personally writes all the rules, appoints the judges himself, and then manages to win first prize in front of the entirely unsurprised staff. 8. 4 years later, at the 1938 World Cup in France, Italy took to the pitch wearing entirely black jerseys, an unmistakable and deliberately provocative visual tribute to the fascist movement that had sponsored their football program. The defending champions won the tournament again while the dark shadows of an approaching world war were already gathering, with ominous inevitability across the entire European continent. It was the equivalent of someone turning up to the last carefree party before a global catastrophe wearing their most inflammatory statement outfit and genuinely expecting compliments. 9. During the Second World War, the planned tournaments of 1942 and 1946 were canceled entirely, because the world was demonstrably occupied with existential problems of considerably greater urgency than international football scheduling. The precious golden trophy suddenly faced a very real danger of being confiscated by the occupying German forces in Italy and simply melted down into raw material for the war effort. Imagine being forced to hide your most irreplaceable family heirloom while uninvited guests carrying weapons methodically search every single room of your home with bureaucratic thoroughness. 10. Italian FIFA Vice President Ottorino Barassi responded to this threat by making a brilliantly low-tech decision and hiding the priceless trophy for 3 complete years inside a plain shoebox tucked underneath his own bed in Rome. The most valuable sporting prize on earth therefore survived the entire devastating war, not inside a fortified vault or diplomatic safe, but wrapped between old socks and worn leather shoes in an ordinary suburban bedroom. It is the elegant historical precursor to the modern security principle that the truly important passwords should never be stored digitally, but written on a scrap of paper buried deep inside your sock drawer. 11. At the 1950 World Cup in Brazil, the football-obsessed host nation suffered one of the most traumatic and completely unexpected defeats in sporting history during the decisive final match, losing to tiny Uruguay in what became eternally known as the Maracanazo. Approximately 200,000 utterly devastated spectators inside the enormous Maracanã Stadium fell into a silence so complete it was described by journalists present as physically oppressive, and the national psychological wound this defeat created never fully healed. It was the equivalent of a celebrated company collapsing live on television on the very day of the stock market listing that was supposed to confirm its permanent greatness. 12. 8 years later, at the 1958 World Cup in Sweden, a 17-year-old boy named Pelé walked onto the world stage and proceeded to dismantle the established footballing order with a lightness and creativity that left the entire sports establishment visibly shaken. He scored twice in the final against the host nation, becoming the youngest World Cup final goal scorer in the history of the competition, a record that still stands as almost biologically implausible. Today, this teenager would already have a 7-figure sponsorship deal, 3 streaming documentaries about his mindset, and a motivational podcast discussing his morning routine in exhaustive detail. 13. Standing alongside Pelé was a player named Garrincha, a man born with severely deformed and differently sized legs whom doctors had confidently told as a small child that he would never walk normally. He went on to become arguably the most joyful and devastating dribbler the game has ever produced, routinely destroying the best defenders on the planet with effortless, almost contemptuous ease. This is the definitive and permanent humiliation for every self-appointed optimization guru who insists that meaningful success is simply a matter of starting with the correct physical parameters and following the right system. 14. Brazil's intoxicating style of play during this golden era gave the world the now legendary phrase "jogo bonito," meaning the beautiful game, a concept that resonated with millions of people across vastly different cultures and continents who had never even met each other. This extraordinary team won the World Cups of 1958, 62, and 70, establishing a sustained dominance over the sport that has since acquired an almost mythological status in global footballing memory. It remains the genuinely rare case in any competitive field where the most beautiful product in the market also turns out to be comprehensively and repeatedly the most successful one. 15. Shortly before the 1966 World Cup in England, the unthinkable happened when the famous Jules Rimet trophy was brazenly stolen from a public exhibition in London, while professional security personnel were theoretically present and responsible for its protection. The entire British nation erupted in collective embarrassment, and Scotland Yard found itself standing before the press with its legendary investigative reputation and absolutely nothing whatsoever to show for it. It was approximately as mortifying as losing the main award at your own gala dinner, while personally presenting a detailed slideshow about the rigor of your security arrangements. 16. The missing trophy was ultimately recovered not by the celebrated Metropolitan Police or any professional investigative agency, but by an ordinary black and white mongrel dog named Pickles who sniffed the wrapped package under a suburban bush during a routine afternoon walk. The entirely unremarkable household pet became an overnight national hero, received a medal, attracted film offers, and secured a lifetime supply of complimentary dog food from an adoring British public. Imagine the entire highly compensated security apparatus failing completely, and the whole situation being rescued by the equivalent of a random intern who wandered past the building at exactly the right moment. 17. Every single African nation boycotted the 1966 World Cup in a coordinated act of collective protest because FIFA had refused to guarantee even one automatic qualification spot for the entire continent's 50-plus member nations. This principled and unified stand produced tangible results as from 1970 onwards, Africa finally received its own dedicated qualification berth within the tournament structure. It is the textbook version of the consistently overlooked employee who simply resigns in silence and thereby proves conclusively to the entire organization just how indispensable they had been throughout the whole time they were being ignored. 18. At the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, Brazil won the tournament for the third time, and therefore earned the right under the existing FIFA rules to keep the original Jules Rimet trophy permanently and unconditionally. This irreplaceable golden trophy was then stolen again in 1983 in Rio de Janeiro and has never been recovered, meaning it was almost certainly melted down into anonymous raw gold shortly after its disappearance. The most historically significant trophy in world sport therefore likely ended its existence as an unremarkable lump of metal, with roughly the same dignity as a shredded Banksy canvas processed through an industrial paper shredder. 19. The 1986 World Cup in Mexico delivered two of the most philosophically irreconcilable goals in the entire history of the sport, both scored by Argentine genius Diego Maradona in a single incandescent quarter-final match against England that the world has never stopped discussing. He first punched the ball into the net with his hand and told the referee it was the hand of God. Then 4 minutes later, he dribbled through virtually the entire English team in what has since been officially voted the greatest goal ever scored. That is the equivalent of one person shamelessly lying during a job interview and then immediately demonstrating such overwhelming natural talent that the hiring committee genuinely forgets to care about the lie. 20. At the 2006 World Cup in Germany, French superstar Zinedine Zidane chose to conclude his glittering and celebrated career in the final by driving his forehead directly into the chest of Italian defender Marco Materazzi during normal playing time in front of the entire watching world. Instead of departing with the trophy he had spent an entire career chasing, one of the most aesthetically gifted players the sport has ever produced walked off the pitch with a red card and an entry in the Scandal Hall of Fame. It is precisely the equivalent of a chief executive delivering his composed and heartfelt farewell address to the board, then spectacularly shattering the microphone against the conference table halfway through his final sentence. 21. At the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, Morocco became the first African nation in the entire 92-year history of the tournament to reach the semifinals, shattering a barrier that had stood for decades as if it were a permanent feature of the sporting landscape. The image of star player Achraf Hakimi running to embrace his mother on the pitch after that historic victory was shared millions of times across every platform and every language simultaneously. It remains one of the rarest categories of viral moment, one that was not engineered by a marketing department or timed for algorithmic impact, but simply happened because the emotion was entirely real and entirely uncontainable. 22. In 2026, for the very first time in its nearly century-long history, the FIFA World Cup is being hosted simultaneously in 3 different countries: the USA, Mexico, and Canada, with the field of participants expanded to an unprecedented 48 teams. Given the sheer number of matches and the diversity of venues, stretching from Vancouver and Mexico City to New York, the logistical challenge of this 3-nation format makes every previous edition seem positively modest by comparison. What once began as a tournament few were willing to undertake a sea voyage to attend has evolved, without serious competition, into the greatest shared event that humanity experiences together every 4 years. 3 cheers for Jules Rimet.